Welcome back to the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. This is the third episode in a series of 5 that we are calling Network Nation. We began with the first episode, Crisis Nation, because this conversation about reimagining community, diaspora, homeland, is in the context of 2 crises, post-COVID and post-war. And we began this series talking about the Armenian nation as a crisis nation, going from crisis to crisis. The second episode was Knowledge Nation, that which needs to be known in order to be able to navigate in this post-crisis situation. Next week, on Wednesday, our episode is called Network Nation. Armenians have been a network nation forever, since before the term existed. And we will talk about what was and what can be. And finally, the last episode, next Friday, is called Global Nation. And we'll be talking with communities around the world where representatives of those communities will speak about their experiences. And these are communities we don't usually hear from or about. Beirut, Istanbul, Moscow, Buenos Aires, I left one out, Tbilisi. This week, we're calling today's episode Digital Nation. Are Armenians a digital nation? How were digital spaces used before, during, and after the war? Are there new communities forming online? Has philanthropy changed? Can you be a church parish if you're online? What about cyber nationalism, cyber patriotism, cyber activism? And who won the cyber war? To speak about these topics, we have 7 guests. Professor Peter Rutland, Professor of Government at Wesleyan. On digital politics, Sarah Lee Whitson. On digital war, Manana a data scientist. On digital religion, forgive me, that's a very quick way of terming it, Father Mesrop Ash. On digital philanthropy, Peter Abadjian. And on communities of intention, communities forming on and offline, Armineh Babikian, who is founder of Therapists for Armenia. And finally, on the digital economy in Armenia, Karapetian, who is economy minister. Before we begin, let me reintroduce our 2 permanent participants, guests, colleagues. Dr. Vicken Cheterian, political scientist, journalist, analyst, who teaches at the University of Geneva and at Webster University in Geneva, although he's currently in Yerevan. And there we're working on a collaborative project with the Institute. And of course, Dr. Shushan Karapetian, Deputy Director of the Institute of Armenian Studies. Welcome back, Vicken and Shushan.
Thanks, Salpi.
Good evening.
Good evening in Yerevan, good morning, good noon here on the West Coast. Vicken, Shushan, before we begin hearing from today's participants, let me ask you, digital nation, what does that mean? What has that come to mean? Shushan, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think a digital nation, just by definition, is a connected or network nation that, provides and amplifies access, connection, networks, gradually doing away with boundaries that prevented these possibilities, whether it's access to knowledge and cultural heritage. Here I'm thinking of digital libraries, digital museums, or my own Armenian heritage class where Father Mesrop Ash joined from San Francisco, Dr. Razmik Panosyan joined from Portugal. I'm thinking connections of all kinds in terms of producing and reproducing cultural heritage. I mean, our own My Armenian Story project, right? It's a crowdsourced oral history project that has no geographic, no physical boundaries, could be conducted entirely on a digital platform and will be archived digitally. So I think these kind of networks that are intentional and intersectional are part of this new definition or vision of a digital nation. I think, in today's conversation, I'm hoping that we're going to talk about enhanced economic vitality, the strengthening of civic inclusivity, new ways of community building and identity making and performing, right? Because so much of it is a performance, new platforms for cultural production, and all of this bottom up and top down. So that's interesting. But here I'm going to borrow from Peter's work. I think we do have to be attentive and aware that there is now a dependence of culture and politics on digital media and their logic. And what does that mean? So there is a dependence of culture and politics on digital media and the logic of the digital media, right? I'm thinking of algorithms here that are pushing certain content up and certain content down. So this kind of enhanced mediatization of our lives, whether it's our political lives, our social lives, our personal communication, our cultural reproduction, how will that evolve on these new media?
You've just upped the ante on today's program. Let's see if we can at least
like
tackle half
everyone.
of that. But thank you. Vicken, your take on digital nationhood.
Yes, in digital nationhood, there are two elements. There's the digital, which is a technology, and there's the nation, which is a social group. So it depends how the nation is organized and how the nation is able to profit from the opportunities of this new technological means.
Okay. And we're going to see about that, because there are also theories that some of that which strengthens the borderless nation is not necessarily good for the state of the nation. So we'll see. So I suppose it's time that we introduce our first guest and start. We do have many guests today. Our first guest is Peter Rutland, who works on contemporary Russian politics and political economy. And he works and writes on nationalism as well. He's a professor of government at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, where he's colleagues with Cheterian, whom we heard from in the last episode. So, Professor Peter Rutland, welcome.
Very glad to be here.
Peter, you've written that nationalism became even more engaging and entertaining in the digital age, that it's no longer an elitist enterprise. It became more accessible for ordinary folk. I'm afraid to ask, what do you mean engaging and entertaining?
Well, the boom in nationalism began before the internet. It began in the 1990s, really. The increased attention to nationalist mobilization with the Yugoslav wars, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, with the achievement of independence for Armenia and the other countries. And at the same time, the internet was growing, and by the 2000s, we see the possibility of this digital nationalism, which we're talking about, as a mass phenomenon. And what the internet does, as we've discussed already, is make possible rapid, instantaneous communication at no cost with an infinite number of people. So it's really a communications revolution, just as the invention of newspapers, mass newspapers in the 19th century made possible mass nationalism with a mass audience reading the paper every day.
So what's
now we have a mass audience.
What's the consequence of that mass audience becoming so much more accessible?
Right. It's too early to say, right? It's only 20 years or so that we've experienced this. So we're seeing more people getting more involved, more quickly, with larger numbers, with no central control, because it's a network. Anybody can put a thing on TikTok or upload a cell phone of a tower exploding in Gaza Strip, and within minutes, millions of people are watching it, right? So this is new territory. We don't know where this is going. And the internet brings emotion as well. It brings visual material very quickly, and a sense of intimacy, like, okay, Zoom is not perfect for intimacy, but it's more intimate than reading a newspaper, because I can see the reactions on your faces. You know, it's this visual, personal, it breaks down the barrier between the private and the public. So the internet is a tremendously revolutionary tool, and we're seeing its influence in politics, but it has a negative side as well as a positive side.
Vicken, do you want to jump in?
Yes. If we look back in the 1990s when the internet started developing, the idea was that the internet will help democracy to develop. Now, with the social media, we are talking about the impact of the new technologies in spreading fake news, in spreading nationalism, populism, I mean, is there some middle road in between these two ideas, these two concepts?
Yeah, well, the old media that had hierarchy, that had editors, that had a kind of filter to get false news out. Although, as we're learning from the BBC in the past week, that traditional news gatherers can also put false news into circulation. So we shouldn't idealize the old media, much as I love the BBC. So in the new world, with this capacity for spreading of false information, because nobody's really regulating it, we're still finding our way, right? So Facebook and Twitter have tried to introduce more filters, but the bad news or the fake news seems to be winning the battle. If you look at the studies of people retweeting news and Facebook algorithms, often it's the more scary or ridiculous or outrageous news gets more retweets, more clicks than the boring reality. So there's this battle going on between truth and falsity. And so from the point of view of building a community, building a nation online, there's a danger that you kind of lose control of the narrative, and the crazy people can very easily penetrate the debate.
Not only lose control of the narrative, but one of the things you've said is that there is this concept now of a daily plebiscite, a daily vote, a daily mandate for people online to adopt a position on all that is happening. What does that mean? That might be great for daily engagement, but what does that mean for long-term policymaking?
Well, that term daily plebiscite goes back to the 1870s, to Ernst Renan, one of the main theorists of the 19th century French nationalism. And he was referring to the newspaper, that you're reading the newspaper daily and you're expressing your political views by which newspaper you read. Now we've got that on steroids. Now it's like every minute. And as you say, it's interactive, so you can kind of express a view and sign petitions, or just by watching something express support. So it's becoming the other dimension to this is that it's a mile wide and an inch deep, because it's free, it's easy, but what is your commitment when you express those views online? And I'll be interested to see later on when you talk about philanthropy and so on, because it can actually translate from online to offline, to sending money, or even to taking part in political action, right? This is the big debate around the Arab Spring, which is widely seen as one of the first political events that was kind of triggered online and then moved onto the streets in Cairo.
Shushan, do you want to jump in?
Peter, could you quickly comment maybe on diaspora engagement with digital nationalism, kind of engagement outside of state borders and boundaries?
Yeah, well, and this goes back to the point that Vicken raised earlier, that the internet made possible much more easily the connection of diasporas. So nations that were dispersed across international borders now had a way to easily and cheaply communicate. So some of the earliest users of the internet for national community building were marginalized and oppressed groups such as the Tamils of Sri Lanka and the Sikhs of Punjab, because they didn't have state of their own with their own state media as a foundation to communicate. They started using the internet, and they had large, widespread diasporas around the world. So that was a plus for nation building. There is a negative, though, that the same internet that can be used to mobilize people can be used to monitor and control them. So authoritarian governments, such as the Chinese or the Uzbek governments, are able more easily to monitor their diasporas by watching at what people are saying on social media and then kind of going after them. So it's democratic in some respects, but we see this battle between authoritarianism and democracy playing out in the internet sphere. And we've seen how the People's Republic of China in particular has become very effective at using the internet to consolidate its grip and to monopolize the narrative of Chinese nationality and Chinese patriotism.
Professor Rutland, one of the things you've said, and maybe we'll begin to conclude with this, is the term you use is that digital space becomes a crucial space for national imagination and community boundary making. Not community making. You call it community boundary making. What is that?
Well, any form of communication is, the roots of the word is it creates community, right? So by communicating with somebody, you're establishing a dialogue, and the internet makes it possible to have that dialogue in your native language, with websites or other embedding that identity, but at the same time, you are not communicating with others. So if you're a Russian living in Ukraine, you can be watching Russian TV and you can be watching Russian social media. So you're excluding yourself from Ukrainian language or Kiev-based media. So you are making choices about which groups you are spending your time with. So in that sense, it may be more unconscious than conscious, but you are drawing boundaries between the people you're communicating with and the people you're not communicating with, not listening to. Whereas in an idealized democratic public sphere, you have to talk to each other. The Democrats should be talking to the Republicans. In the digital world, that's less and less likely to happen, it seems.
We saw so much of that during the war and after, this drawing of boundaries, daily, it seemed, repackaging of the current urgent issues, the make or break issues of the day. And on the one hand, it drove the cyber war, it drove better fundraising and huge awakening. But on the other hand, it appears to be continuing to do damage, since it really pushes the complexities to these uber simple questions and answers and categories. Vicken, do you want to add anything before we thank Peter and move on?
Yeah, just to follow your argument, nationalism was born out of the intelligentsia, right? Those people who wrote historical novels, journalists writing articles. Today, in the space of the social media, it's not the intellectuals who are running the show, who are creating the content of this new nationalism. It's the digital savvy people who know how to manipulate images, videos. How is that changing the content of the nation?
Of the nation.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, that the intellectuals, the historians, the poets, they were the leaders, often actual leaders of the nationalist movements of the 19th century, even up until the 1980s and Georgia and Estonia and so on. Yeah, nowadays it's in the hands of personalities, of celebrities, of DJs, of some of them with sound politics, some of them with not such sound politics. And so yeah, that's another element of the kind of randomness that's creeping in. That you have, even there was a case a couple of weeks ago of the Korean boy band BTS getting involved in a nationalist spat with the Chinese over I can't remember how it started now, but yeah, so the national dialogue is being driven by people who haven't thought through the politics of what they're doing, and they're just using it to kind of sell records or to please the fans, and then they find themselves getting into all kinds of complicated arguments.
Indeed. Peter Rutland, professor at Wesleyan, professor of government, thank you for giving us food for thought and for drawing some of the comparisons with other places in the world, because for sure this digital nation building isn't just in the Armenian sphere. Thank you, Professor Peter Rutland, for participating.
Thank you so much.
Our next guest is Sarah Lee Whitson, who is executive director of DAWNMENA. I hope I'm saying that. That's Democracy for the Arab World Now, Middle East and North Africa. This is the organization that was established by Jamal Khashoggi before he was assassinated on orders of the Saudi government. Sarah Lee is a graduate of both the Alex Pilibos School in Los Angeles and Harvard. I like saying that. And has been a vocal professional in human rights organizations for decades. Sarah Lee, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for accepting. I know that a few things are happening in the Middle East these days, and you might have been a bit busy. So thanks for being here. Sarah Lee, I'm going to start, and my colleagues Vicken and Shushan are going to continue. Talk about how digital platforms are being used by marginalized groups, nations around the world to share info about causes, interests, what works, how are the coalitions being built? In other words, whatever happened during the war, what can that process be compared to, and what's there to learn from?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I've just written about this this week in an article analyzing, for example, the shift in the public narrative about Israel and Palestine, particularly in the wake of this most recent round of fighting in Gaza, as well as the attacks on protesters in Al-Aqsa, and some of the attacks on Palestinian civilians, citizens of Israel inside Israel proper. I think what we've seen is that the digital media has made it possible for Palestinian voices in particular, who have by and large been completely ignored and excluded from mainstream media, to leapfrog over mainstream media and bring the reality of Israel's military occupation, Israel's apartheid, to the forefront of people on Twitter, people on Facebook, people on LinkedIn, and have managed to really change the discussion and change the terminology that's used from their on-the-ground reporting. It's tremendously important for a place like Gaza, for example, where Gaza is under complete closure. It's nearly impossible for Gazans to get out and to interact in normal ways, and very hard for the international media to get in. We just learned that BBC was actually kept out of Gaza in this most recent round of fighting. So there's a deliberate effort by governments to silence the media and silence media coverage, and having social media allows citizens to communicate directly to the world what's happening on the ground and what the reality looks like through the fog of war. We've seen. Sorry, I mean, they're not the only example. They are the most recent example, but obviously in the United States, we've seen how marginalized communities, people of color, the Black Lives Matter movement has in the same way not only leapfrogged over the mainstream media in terms of reporting, documenting what's happening, the video of George Floyd's murder, and so forth, but changing the terminology that we use, the narrative we use to describe that reality.
Sarah, one of the biggest complaints, frustrations we heard during the war was, the silence of the international community, that what was happening in Artsakh was not getting enough coverage in the proper outlets and so on. Can you, and one conversation we constantly had among our staff was maybe instead of all the doctors and lawyers, we could have used a few more journalists, right? A few more people in PR, a few more people in cybersecurity and so on. Can you maybe touch on the importance of being in the room, and I mean both physically and virtually, so that you can help drive conversations, you can help influence conversations and so on?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I mean, I certainly was part of many of those discussions where people were very frustrated at the lack of international media coverage of the recent war in Artsakh and so forth. And one of the challenges that is going to be very hard to surmount is that, that part of the world is not well understood, is not well known. The population numbers are very, very small, and they don't tie into international, global, regional power contests the way that the war in Syria does, the way that the war in Israel-Palestine does, and so forth. And so unless there is a catastrophically high death toll of civilians, which fortunately there wasn't, it's going to be very, very hard to capture global attention the way that other conflicts with much higher death tolls, where the players include the superpowers, various superpowers, it's going to be very hard to do that. Another challenge is that while there was quite a bit of social media saturation, there is a language barrier. So the people on the ground don't have the same facility, English, for example, which still remains the lingua franca of the globe, and for global news issues to communicate as actively as they might have been communicating in Armenian, in Russian, in Azeri, Turkish, and so on. And so, a simple answer is to have more people who can actually communicate very clearly in English. But you're absolutely right in terms of the local media presence and local reporting groups and advocacy groups who can have been doing a lot more to have had very clearly articulated talking points that don't mirror the talking points of the government, of any government, and that reflected a more real-time reporting from the ground in a more coordinated way. But this is the sort of thing that you sadly learn by experience and by difficult experience. And I certainly hope that there isn't another difficult experience where folks will get to test their learned experience. But that's certainly part of it. And it would be good, for example, to have standing civil society organizations that do just that have an articulated position on the conflict, on the Armenian government's response, on the Azeri government's response, the Turkish government's response, and so forth, as opposed to trying to come up with them on the spur of the moment in the face of the crisis.
Vicken, do you want to pick up on that? Digital politics, how the Armenian experience was, what it might be?
Yes, my question would be, when we talk about politics and the digital space, we cannot separate one side from the entire players of the conflict. So when we talk about Gaza, there's the Gaza Palestinians communicating through digital media, through social media, but there's also the Israeli government. In the case of the Karabakh conflict, there's the Armenian side, but also there's the Azerbaijani side. So what are the lessons learned? How can we pass the message while on the other side we have states with more money, more capabilities, networking possibilities for smaller players like Armenians of Karabakh, like the Palestinians of Gaza? What can they do?
Sarah Lee?
Is that a question for me?
Uh-huh.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I just, it wasn't clear to me. I don't know that the Palestinians or have any advantage in terms of their diaspora connections and diaspora integration than Armenians do.
Or don't?
In fact, no, they don't. I don't think they do. In fact, I think there's so much in parallel between the Armenian experience and the Armenian diaspora experience and the Gazan experience or the Palestinian experience and the Palestinian diaspora experience. If anything, one could say that the Armenians are at an advantage in that they actually have a solid national state representation in the UN, in various international bodies, where they also have space to articulate Armenian national interests as they see them. So there's a tremendous parallel. Honestly, I don't even know that the connections of the Palestinian diaspora community to Palestine are qualitatively stronger or deeper than Armenian diaspora connections. If anything, I think that many in the Palestinian diaspora community have modeled their diaspora organization, particularly the United States, around the Armenian community, and frankly, not just Palestinians, but Muslim Americans generally, see Armenians as a relative success story in maintaining national identity and ethnic identity that's deeply rooted in their history and their culture in a way that other American diaspora communities have not. I mean, pick your nationality. And there's a reason for that. Of course, Armenians have had a historical grievance, and as do Palestinians, as do Muslim Americans, and that becomes a cause around which Armenians organize. And I think one of the challenges will be, now that Biden has said the magic words of the Armenian genocide, will that in fact dissipate the Armenian community's energy and organizing? And how is that translated into the transcendent step that people like Salpi have taken, which is to center their work and thoughts and advocacy around this nation state of Armenia for all its ills and all its sins, as opposed to exclusively around the historical experience of genocide.
The links are unavoidable. You can't do one without the other. Sarah Lee Whitson.
There is a disconnect. Sorry.
Yes, there is. No, I just wanted to say thanks for your wisdom. Thank you. Sarah Lee Whitson, Executive Director of DAWNMENA, is in New York and was with us, thankfully. Thank you, Sarah Lee. We'll keep talking to you. And next, we're going to invite Manana Hakobyan, who is a master's candidate at Harvard University at the Institute of Applied Computation and Science. Her field is data science. She's a graduate of the United World College in Dilijan and a co-founder and CEO of DataPoint Armenia. And if we'd allowed her, she would have brought her 5, 6, 7 co-founding initial board colleagues in DataPoint to join us. But unfortunately, we've only got just a few minutes to speak with Manana. Manana, welcome.
Hi, Salpi. Thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. And we salute you and your colleagues, all of whom either still in university or just graduating, and the focus on data science and creating DataPoint Armenia. We've been talking to you, Shushan and I, at the Institute for a while, so we're going to build on that. Shushan?
Manana, maybe you can start with telling us what is DataPoint Armenia, how it was formed in layman's terms, and what projects were you working on or found most significant during the war, during and after the war?
And Manana Jan, you know we just have 10, 12 minutes, so get as much in as
I'll
you
be
can.
fast. DataPoint Armenia is a non-profit organization for accelerating the development of data science in Armenia. While data science itself is a new term in the science field, it is the science of collecting, cleaning, analyzing, matching the patterns from a very big data or information. So we pledge to use data and information for the good of Armenia. And when the war happened, that's exactly what we did. We realized that it's an informational war from the other side, and there is a lot of influx of information from both Ghazari and Armenian side. And our first instinct was to manage or analyze the information that we were seeing on the platforms.
Vicken, do you want to jump in about the work?
Yes. How did you manage that? Because not only Azerbaijan was leading a propaganda war, but also the Armenian state was leading a propaganda war and not informing its public opinion with the real developments in the battlefield. How did you manage that?
Yes. So saying that we knew everything that was happening in the beginning, no, we didn't. But we realized that there is a pattern of people having the war happening on the social media and more precisely Twitter. So we decided to collect all the tweets. And when we're talking about the volume, it's millions of tweets. And we didn't suspect that there is, like, Armenian government is driving some manipulative campaign or Azeri government is driving. It was just realizing that there is a lot of information and let's start collecting it. And after collecting it, and we started analyzing, and we had some findings that I'll share with you if Salpi allows me and at the time allows me.
Well, Manana, I think we're dying to know who won the information war, and more importantly, what did we learn from whatever you discovered, studied, analyzed? What is the significance?
Yes, so I do not want to be the first one to publicly announce that we lost the information war because it sounds harsh. But I think we were not perfect in it, and there are a lot of lessons that we need to learn. One of our findings was about the hashtags and how they were trending over time. And if we say that the success metric in information war was to take your narrative to a broader audience, then we would see, like after our analysis, that Armenians had many hashtags with less frequent tweets, while Azeri had very few hashtags with a lot of tweets concentrated, which made these hashtags trend globally, and their narrative was more likely to reach to broader audience. We were discussing before me how important social media is when you do not have major global news outlets for spreading your informational narrative. And when we as a nation do not have concentrated or managed campaigns or narratives to reach to global audiences, it's really hard to say that we can be competitive in the informational war. And the example that I want to give is that, for example, people like Armenians, they would tweet "recognize Artsakh." I'm not even getting there that there were different spellings for this hashtag all alone, but there would be another narrative where people will tweet "Karabakh is Armenia," and there would be another group of people that will tweet, "Please, stop the terrorism," like the "Stop Azeri terrorism." And all these narratives are different when it comes to making one hashtag or like one narrative trend and reach to global audience. And I guess one of the main important lessons that I will want to convey to people is that we need to have a narrative that we as a nation network work in the digital era of conveying to people. And it doesn't need to be only at the crisis time. It needs to be even now. We do not have New York Times that everyone reads every day. But if we want to reach to global audiences, social media is an amazing and excellent outlet. We just need to be more organized as a nation of what we want to drive.
Manana, the same passion and knowledge and skills that you brought to bear on this issue, on the war, the cyber war, and how it was conducted, what other projects is Data Point working on that have implications, consequences for Armenia and for Armenia diaspora relations? Armenia includes, well, homeland, Armenia and Artsakh.
And I want to add one more thing. Manana, what projects are you working on, and what projects can you potentially work on?
Yeah, so data science is a very multidisciplinary field. It can be applied to economics, it can be applied to agriculture, it can be applied to health, anywhere possible. And anything that has social impact on Armenia, we're happy to take on and work. So right now we're working on in a public health and data science intersection field. We're working in economics and data science intersection. We're working in health, medical image recognition, like building models that will take medical records and do predictions. We're working, this is the information, like a crisis information and misinformation recognition. We're also trying to get into agriculture, and it will be fantastic if one day we get into cybersecurity and national security.
The whole country, all of the national issues. Vicken, do you want to jump in before I ask her how and where diaspora and absence of borders can be useful for all of this?
My question is, of course, big data is a question of quantity, right? You have massive information to analyze. Where does the question of quality come in? I'm thinking about your experience from the war period. Was it a problem of having massive information out there, or was it the question of the quality of information being communicated?
Yeah, that's a good one. So when we are analyzing the information, actually having a lot of information is good. So the thing that we're struggling with is the quality of information. And I would say the quality of information for the data we analyzed was not the best, specifically because we were analyzing information from different languages scattered around. That's like another thing about the information not trending and reaching to global audience. There was Armenian hashtag, there were Russian opinions, there was like English information coming. So everything together was just like a whole mess of information that we had to go into and clean for months. Salpi, I cannot hear you. I lost you.
We can't hear you, Salpi.
I cannot hear, but I'm assuming you're asking me about diaspora because you mentioned. Is it the kind of question? Okay, so I'm just going to say that data science is amazing when it comes to working remotely, because you do not have to be in a physical space to work on a specific project. And that was one of the benefits of Data Point Armenia, because I think right now it's a breach between diasporan Armenians and Armenians inside of Armenia. We have members from Australia, from the United States, from England. So all these people come together and work for Armenia and contribute with their skills. So there is a lot of space actually for diaspora to get involved when it comes to data science and helping Armenia with data science.
Perfect. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good, because I would hate not to be able to say thank you to you. Manana, you've been great, and we hope that the collaboration between the Institute and Data Point Armenia takes off. Your work is amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our next guest is Father Mesrop Ash, who is the parish priest at St. John's Armenian Apostolic Church in San Francisco. Born and raised in California, he traded in a life of tech for a life as a pastor. His congregation's really happy that he made that decision, as are we. Welcome, Dedhar. Now we can't hear you. This isn't good. Aha.
Can you hear
perfect.
Me now?
In fact.
All right. Yeah, this echoes the experience of the past year and a half for all of us. Can you hear me now? Salpi, thank you for having me as part of this esteemed group. This is wonderful, and you guys are doing a great job.
Well, thank you. We're just grateful you're here, because your topic is one that I think is going to be really interesting to most people in diaspora. That is, what did you do for a year and a half of no PAROSes, no, individual church services? How was it? Was it more engagement, less engagement? What happened?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Thank you for checking in with the church community to find out how we've been doing throughout the pandemic. The reality of it is that I've given more PAROSes over the past year than I have, ever. And that's because the pandemic and, of course, the war really transformed the expression of the church and the way that it's engaging with the faithful today. There was always digital ministry. I think there was always, well, not always, but certainly over the past 20 years, we've found an increase of interest and engagement from the church to find the faithful where they're at online, whether it be social media, through video production, or other means. It's been necessary, but it's maybe been a secondary or tertiary priority for the church, because, as you assumed, the church has always been first and foremost a physical experience, going to the church, being with the people, being present with the sacrament.
Smelling the incense.
It's a sensory experience, our Orthodox faith. That's why for all of us, that transition into the digital realm was a bit of a rocky one initially. Even for myself, who, as you mentioned, was already somewhat digitally inclined. From the first day that our church was locked down, we began streaming online. We had the capacity to do that, thank God. Not every church did, but I think in a short period of time, most churches found some means by which to get a stream on Facebook or YouTube, or to
was
Zoom
the
with their
engagement
community.
A two-way engagement? I mean, you were Zooming. Were there people listening and watching?
Yeah. Well, that's part of the problem. I think that was a part of the problem for us. We Armenian priests never went into our calling imagining that we would become reinvented televangelists, preaching to cameras. However, we found ourselves initially in that position, and it was very frustrating. At some point in the summer last year, I think it was around June, I remember confiding in somebody that I never want to see a camera in my church again, and I would rather talk to 2 people than be preaching to a camera and talking to 100. I was just really frustrated with the experience. I was coaching another priest yesterday how to enhance his church's live stream, and he said, "Did I would just wash my hands with this tomorrow if I could. I don't want to do this anymore, but I understand now that my people need it, and it's very important."
Need it and want it?
Need it and want it, and I think that's what we've all come to terms with. Given the specific conditions of our respective communities, I think that we've all come to terms with the fact that the online outreach of our parishes in digital ministry through live streaming, through the capacity that Zoom provides us, both for connecting and preaching, but also for administration and organization, the ability that we have to have fundraising as well. All of these things have truly been enhanced by providing this additional space for community online. I think what we're realizing now is that the sacramental experience within the sanctuary of the Armenian churches is irreplaceable and incomparable. That is what it is, and it can't be replaced by an alternative. However, there's a great deal of space to provide additional experience for our community to meet us where their needs are at and where their comfort zone is at as well. Because even outside of the COVID context, we have faithful who are sick, homebound, distant, and they need to connect with their community, and they can do it this way.
Can I ask a question about this increased engagement? And I'm going to bring an example from language studies because that's what I'm most familiar with, and let's see if there's a parallel. In times of crisis, for example, when a language is categorized as endangered or threatened, you see a lot of heightened engagement, but it's typically at the symbolic or sentimental level. So conferences on language endangerment, but probably not in that language, in the host language, right? You very rarely see on the ground work, people actually learning the language, or people actually, so they're talking about the crisis, but they're not doing the actual work. Do you think this extra engagement will be sustainable in a tangible, instrumental, practical way, or is this kind of a heightened symbolic engagement at the moment of crisis to satisfy some kind of affective need?
And I want to stress that the engagement that I think we're interested in is the engagement of your parish, not just the engagement of the clerics themselves.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think we're in this period of transition where we're trying to understand how to make that engagement sustainable. Initially, of course, at the outset of the pandemic and the lockdown, when the fear was probably at its highest, when people found themselves locked in their homes and didn't know what was happening next, they turned to the church, and the church did have that digital footprint in place to be able to give them a space, to be able to find comfort in their faith and also guidance and stability. And that's nothing new, right? People go through crisis at points throughout their life and always have, and the church has always been there to provide that very crucial source of support in those moments, just as we did during the crisis. So I think that the question is how much of our community is able to and feels empowered to turn to the church in those moments and within the parish, right? As we were discussing yesterday, Salpi, I think, the ideal of the long tail is very important here. We have large communities in our diaspora. So in Los Angeles, we have hundreds of thousands of Armenians. But how often have we organized events or looked at our churches and said, we've got this many people, but we only see this many people that are being active, within our community life? And I think that what we're realizing now is that we have to have a sense of being open and welcoming to all of our community where they're at, bringing them in and accepting them. And this is what I think the digital ministry of the church can do in a sustainable way and give them a place to be a part of community.
Vicken, how's your relationship with the church?
Very good. So my question would be, of course, all of us, we had to experience this Zoom technology and online working, teaching. For me, it was easy to use the technology as long as I had one-way communication. I had something to tell to other people. But to use video conferences to create a complex debate, I mean, at least in my case, I felt the limit of the experience. How is it for the church? How can you use this technology to communicate complex moral issues? Does it function? What is the lessons learned?
And last question after that, is the church's finances situation better or worse during this digital period of ours?
Okay, good. So to answer the first question first, I think that two-way communication is crucial for being able to communicate complex, particularly moral ideas, to be able to have the feedback, that live feedback that's necessary to understand where people are at in terms of your presentation of it, an explanation, and to answer the questions they have. That was certainly, I think, for many of our communities, one of the hardest hurdles that we had to cross was, how do we get beyond the camera and find out what's landing, where are people, what are they hearing, and how can we respond? That's where follow-up comes in. One of the things that I experienced that I think was wonderful was actually being able to find, I can see who's watching on Facebook, right, when they're commenting. I can see who's watching on YouTube when they're commenting. On our website, we have a form where people can check in if they're watching online and ask questions. And the follow-up is really crucial. Thanks for being with us during this time. How did you feel about this message, or is there something that we can help you with right now? That one-on-one feedback, in some ways in this medium, became a little bit more natural because we could connect with people specifically around the issues that they were experiencing in their lives and the message that we were trying to get across at that time. I certainly had that experience. And I think we'll see how that changes over time as we have the hybrid of in-person as well as digital ministry taking place simultaneously.
And
to answer the finances question,
Mm-hmm.
the church, like many institutions, but certainly the church that required the presence of our faithful on a weekly basis to help sustain our activities and our ministries was hit very hard. In addition to that, other functions of the church, our fundraising events, our annual banquets, other sources of income like renting of church hall facilities and things like this, those things immediately ceased because of the pandemic. However, again, maintaining that dialogue with our community, which we were able to do in a digital forum, I think gave us the opportunity to let people know in an immediate way, what's happening in the church, right? Not because they happen to come to church on Sunday and they can find out what's happening, but because we can give them that message in a real-time way. Here's what's happening and here's how you can be involved. That ended up being a very crucial tool for us during the war, because the church was in a position to immediately be able to communicate what the needs were for our communities to be able to support financially the efforts.
Thank you.
And I think that they did so in a wonderful way.
Thank you, Nedhaj.
Thank you.
Father Mesrop Ash, San Francisco, thank you very much for participating.
God bless.
Thank you. Our next guest is Peter Abadjian, Executive Director of the Palos Foundation, which is a humanitarian and development organization that works in Armenia and Artsakh and supports trusted local organizations and works with partners from the diaspora. Peter has been at this for many, many years and is as good an organization leader, fundraiser as there is, and we're going to be talking about digital philanthropy. Peter Abadjian, welcome.
Thank you, Salpi.
So Pete, how's the fundraising work going? How are donors and donations changing? I'm assuming they're changing.
They are, and it's been, it's been a heck of a roller coaster this past year plus. Really starting with the pandemic. We saw most of our donations move from traditional checks in the mail, event-based fundraising to digital platforms. And the digital platform started with our website. We have a very Amazon-ish website where people can log in, pick a project, make a donation, and they move on. They see their name, and then they get some updates in the future, and they understand there's a full circle of that donor organization interaction. But what happened starting with the pandemic was the emergence of these critical needs, emergencies, feeding elderly that were now homebound because of the pandemic, the attacks in Tavush on our kindergarten and military posts there, communities up in July, followed by the war. So things became very different very quickly. Quite frankly, we ended up raising probably 35% more contributions from almost triple the number of donors. So we had an awful lot of small donations that came in through non-traditional digital sources. Stuff to the website directly, but moreover, things via Facebook, things via this thing called Instagram Lives, things from other digital platforms where people stood up and started promoting these specific campaigns. Influencers that we had very little interaction with over the years stepped forward and started rallying forces and contributions from people that had previously, quite frankly, maybe not been engaged, or had been engaged in 2016 following the war. And, their second contribution was this year following this war or during this war.
And these are new donors.
Interesting. Either new donors or infrequent donors. So, I was challenging the staff, our small staff here to give me some information and numbers. And our sense was we had probably 1,000 new contributions last year. And in actuality, it was 2,000 new donors stepped forward, primarily from digital platforms, social media, and the like, to support the COVID crisis and to support the war and the aftermath of the war.
Peter, do you have any sense of any profile of these new donors? I'm talking about country of origin, generational status, socioeconomic, sociolinguistic. Do you have any data?
We do have some data, and it's quite interesting. The majority of these new contributors are young, are social media savvy, are not affiliated with the traditional institutions in our community, want to help, don't bring the baggage to the table that most of the donors can often, most of the affiliation, I should say, not baggage, that most donors traditionally come to the table with, most significant donors. So, somebody that sees a post that moves them or hears something that challenges them and they want to instantly solve that issue. So they go online or they click a button and they make a $25 or a $50 contribution. So it's that generation. It's the generation that, folks like Salpi and I have discussed for years, whether or not we're going to challenge them to engage them in the future of this, rally. And quite frankly, they've stepped up. Now the challenge becomes, what do we do to service them, and how do we continue to keep them engaged? There were three things that I sort of want to mention really quickly. One is this business affiliation. Businesses, primarily Armenian owned, but not necessarily, stepped up because of an Armenian appeal or an Armenian employee, or the fact that they were owned by Armenians, to donate proceeds to the cause. And that was a phenomenon that we've seen here and there, but this was something that was so prevalent that we began dedicating some of our social media time to promoting those businesses that are rallying community support. And that was sort of a first time we had seen something at this level. I think there were 130 businesses in the LA and Yerevan area that we could sort of find or hear about that were promoting this kind of, donating a significant portion of proceeds from something to the cause. The rise of influencers in our community, and this is something that I'm talking about, but I have no idea how you become one or how you do this thing. But
and an influencer is a personality on social media with a large following. Therefore, they influence.
Correct. So, the rise of those kinds of influencers focused on, COVID support, helping people that were trapped in their homes, and then providing relief and support during the war and after the war, became significant. And we had these things called Instagram Lives, where we were interviewed or we were engaging with other people,
And the third?
and that became a significant source. And the third were these this rise of this idea of monthly contributors. Make your commitment to the cause on a regular basis. We had some of those folks primarily to support a music program, and all of a sudden that blossomed into tenfold of what we had, now making monthly contributions of various amounts just because it's important for us to be engaged.
What you're saying is fascinating. Look, Vicken and I and you, a little bit more than Shushan, because we've lived in these, diaspora institutional circles. I don't know how many times, Vicken, we have heard, if every Armenian gives $1 a month, right? How many times have we heard that formulation? But look at what you're saying. We've been saying they need to give because they're Armenian. You're saying they're giving to something. And
Correct.
That's where this regular commitment is coming from. What a thought.
And a surprising number of those we're giving to something translates to where we don't care. It's not necessarily war relief or COVID relief. They're picking other projects, or they're just saying, you guys decide. We trust you, you guys decide. But
Vicken, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm very curious to learn whether this is a California phenomenon, is this a US phenomenon, or do you have similar trends in Yerevan, in Russia, in Europe, elsewhere? And the second question in relation to this is, if this is very American experience, can we transplant it in other places? Are you a step ahead of the rest of the world?
Always.
As usual? Yeah.
California.
I think things start here in California, but these monthly contributions and these new donors in general have come from all around the world. We have donations coming in from Yerevan to the U.S. so we can implement projects in Yerevan or in Armenia. It's quite an interesting occurrence, and part of that I think is because perhaps we're maybe a trusted organization, or perhaps people know me, or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that should not be underestimated. Peter has been doing this for a couple of decades and is trusted and completes the circle, which many organizations don't. You go back and you account and you're transparent.
Well, and that transparent word is now this giant burden that every Armenian organization in the diaspora faces, and we are particularly cognizant of and working very hard to respond, because you have this dichotomy between donors. So a digital donor sees a post, clicks a button, and they've made their donation, and they're done. They have their little acknowledgement and they move on. But from an organizational standpoint, they want to know, that donor wants to know what happened. I donated my $50 or $100 or $1,000. What happened? And now, when you're doing development work and you're building a family, a home, for instance, that takes 3 months. And you have a donor that has a very quick response and a very short expectation, patience towards a result, and now we have to provide them information on a basis to bring them to, well, your donation 3 months later moved a family into a home, or fed somebody, et cetera, et cetera.
Pete, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. We've got 2 more guests and we're going to move on, but I think this aspect, Vicken's question, the fact that Armenia Fund in France, for example, does so much of what you're saying in terms of, completing a circle. There's so much there to talk about. Sorry, we can't do it now, but please, thank you for your insights. Truly useful.
Thank you for having me.
Peter Abadjian, Executive Director of the PAROS Foundation. Our next guest is Armineh Babikian, who is an occupational therapist and practices in New York. She founded Therapists for Armenia. This is an organization of occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech therapists. And the reason we've invited Armineh is because what this is a symbol of, an example of, is new ways of forming community. So let me welcome Armineh Babikian before we go on talking about the new sort of direction that this digital world has taken us. Armineh Babikian, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Armineh, look, there is this phrase that sociologists use called communities of intention. That is, people come together with an intent, with a purpose, not necessarily because of identities or belongings or hereditary identities, but for a purpose. Is the Therapists for Armenia a community of intention?
Yes, I think it definitely is, because it really started out of the intention of professionals who share a passion for what they do, and also how they can, connect with their Armenian partners. So our organization is really based both in the diaspora but also locally, and really just to create that bridge. And the common passion is this, rehabilitation profession that we all engage in, and we all have our different expertise in that.
I see you're in the office. We've caught you at work.
Yes, I'm in the clinic now.
Armineh, I'm curious how
yes.
it all started. So, okay, you have this idea, and you reach out to whom? To a professional colleague in Armenia, to a professional colleague in what are the links that you used, or the networks that you used?
And would you have done this if it were not for a digital world? Could you have done this?
So honestly, it started from my own personal volunteer experiences in Armenia, and my own connection of helping with different organizations that work with individuals with disabilities. For the past 4 years, I've been going back and forth, but there was always this interest.
You're a birthright volunteer. You're a birthright
yes, I
Armenia
did birthright.
volunteer.
Yeah, I did Birthright Armenia, and that's what really helped to establish this connection initially, and then I just continued with it. Each year I would return and do workshops and trainings with different organizations. And there was, on my last trip in 2019, there was a big interest in other expertise and other topics that I didn't necessarily have experience in, but I knew there had to be other experts who would gladly help Armenia and help provide support in this way. And then I also was being connected with diasporan rehab professionals who really wanted to get involved in Armenia but didn't know how and didn't know about the field there. So it just seemed like there was this gap and a lack of connection between the two. So that's what inspired my initial idea to start this organization, was to really just create that bridge between rehab professionals who are interested in helping the Armenian community. And because it started in late 2019, and already from my generation, I'm so used to, utilizing digital platforms. So I had individuals from California, from New York, from New Jersey, from Armenia, all who were interested in this project. So really from the start, it was based off of digital interactions. And it started with just a Facebook group, honestly. But I didn't really know how to build it further to really strengthen those connections. But with COVID, it pushed us into everything being digital, and it no longer was a challenge of how are we going to do this? Is this possible?
Just did it.
We really, we did it, and we got connected. We were able to create newsletters together, host webinars,
do you want to jump
have
in?
meetings.
If I understand right, your organization has the intention of helping develop Armenia. Is there also diaspora connections? Do you also profit from the experience of other diasporan colleagues in the States, elsewhere?
Yeah, It really is building this network. I mean, we have connected diaspora professionals from, we have about like 15 different states involved and represented in our organization who attend our meetings bi-weekly. We have connections with the French diaspora who are involved in rehab and in Armenia, in Lebanon. So
Vicken,
it really
is your
is
question
both national.
I'm sorry, Armineh. Vicken, is your question whether this organization would also be of service to diaspora needs?
Yes, and the answer was it's not just Armenia, because you, as I understand, you also work in Lebanon, so that's diaspora cooperation.
Yes,
Armineh,
because
sorry, I want to ask
Sure.
a follow-up question as you answer. Are there language barriers? I know, in talking to, for example, psychologists.
She's a linguist,
right?
could you tell?
Sorry, guys. This is going to happen. I know in talking to other professionals, for example, mental health professionals, right? There are a lot of groups forming. And one of the barriers with professionals training professionals, I'm not even talking about professional patient, was language barriers. And if were there language barriers? If so, how were they addressed?
Armineh?
Yes,
Oh, no.
definitely. There are definitely language barriers because even amongst the diaspora, we have Armenians who speak Armenian and those who don't, and in Armenia as well, those who speak English and those who don't. So we really take advantage of those who are bilingual to help with interpretation, and we've hired simultaneous interpreters for our trainings, for the webinars, the clinical webinars that we hosted. We had a weekly webinar series for war injuries that lasted from December through to April. And so simultaneous interpretation was really key
Armineh,
in
last
helping
question.
facilitate that.
Real quick.
Yeah.
Does this have legs? Is it
It
sustainable?
does. Yeah, it's really grown, I think, because there is so much of an interest from both sides to have this connection and continue to grow the relationship and exchange these, professional experiences and it really showed us that we don't have to physically be in Armenia in order to help, or vice versa. People don't have to come here to learn. We can have this exchange of experiences and exchange of knowledge digitally and also share it with everyone.
Thank you. I apologize for cutting you off, but we've got one more
That's
guest,
all right.
and we want to do this. I'm so grateful to you for participating. Thank you, Armineh.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Armineh Babikian, founder of Therapists for Armenia. Our last guest, because if we're talking about a digital nation, then we've got to talk about economics. And so we've invited Vahan Karapetian, who has been Armenia's Minister of Economy for less than a year. Prior to that, he was known as a businessman. He was a known businessman, one of the first who jumped into the digital economy, actually, and he created Menu.am, Armenia's answer to Uber Eats. Vahan Karapetian, Minister, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Salpi, for inviting me to this very impressive event.
Thank you.
I also very glad to know Armineh. Impressive what she has done.
And when I was talking to her, she mentioned several other organizations, sports therapy and others that are, again, very niche, very focused, Armenia diaspora, and working. So it's a fascinating time. Minister, we've got about 14 minutes. And I know that you mentioned that there are recent job numbers in Armenia and that they're good numbers. Let's start with that and talk about how it's possible, given everything that's happened, COVID, war, loss, distrust, no hope. How are these numbers good? And then let's talk about the digital economy, please.
First of all, we have to differentiate the virtual reality from the real reality. And actually, this is now a very big difference in Armenia. So, but you know that media is working in a very negative way, and the life is not so negative as it is presented. And of course, it's a difficult time, but I mean, economy is fully rebounded, because I mean, job numbers are exciting actually, and we have a rise compared to last year, like 14.5% job numbers, and
Month on
rise
month.
from month
Year
on
on.
month, and jump year on year, and compared to 2019, it's a 5.7% increase, so that we can say that we are better than any other April before. Yes, and not only that, I mean, we have exciting numbers also in the exports growth. It's 66% growth compared to last year, and it's again very astonishing growth. And I think that many other areas of economy are just better than ever.
I wish we had time to go into that, but can we move to digital economy and talk about what Armenia is doing and what it can do? You know, we talk about Armenia's tech sector, recognized, successful, proud, but if we go deeper into other sectors of the economy, where economic output is based not on manufacturing, but on technology, what's the situation and what's the prospectus?
Yeah, this is a very good and important question, issue, and you know, we talk a lot about the low productivity of Armenia's economy, and that it's very low. Yeah? I mean, the average product per hour is approximately $6, and compared to average OECD figures, it's 43. Yeah, and we are like 7 times lower in productivity than average in OECD countries, and it's twice as low as our peers in Eurasian Economic Union. So we have to do a lot to improve our productivity, and we have programs like designed for large companies, and programs designed for small and medium enterprises, so that we improve this. So we think that improvement will go in three waves. Yeah. First, it's like injection in capital to import technologies that are current, that are modern. The second is that we invest and provide companies the modern knowledge, and to invite the best consultants and best consulting companies to come over and help modernize businesses. And the third is digitalization of the business. And here we have a very poor situation. Just 9% of these small and medium enterprises can be assessed to be digitally selfish and digitally current. Yeah? And all other companies in the small and medium enterprise sector is lacking digitalization, and we are here to help them, to give them digital tools so that they move their accounting into the mobile phones and all other
turn the whole administrative infrastructure.
Business techniques. And here we have a lot to do, and we are just, I mean, I'm less than 6 months minister, and we are there to, we have many programs started.
Vicken, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I have a very different question. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and in Armenia the vaccination campaign has huge problems, And because of all the problems in politics, the post-war consequences, we are not talking about this. There's not enough public campaigns to push the population to vaccination. This will have enormous consequences on the economy. What are you doing? What is your ministry doing so that the population accepts vaccination campaign?
Firstly, currently, COVID is not a big issue just in Armenia. Of course, we realize that to be reintegrated into the world's economy, we need to get vaccination to proper levels as soon as possible, and we started from acquiring necessary levels of the vaccines from different countries.
But people's
Russia,
willingness to take it, willingness and ability.
I think it's picking up. I mean, recently I took my parents and my brother together with me to the vaccination, and I mean, a lot of people are changing their perception to the vaccination, and it's going better. I mean, if you compare last week's results, it's better than many weeks before aggregated, and I think that people are more willing to get vaccinated. I think that given that major states, major countries already announced that the green passports or digital vaccinations are mandatory for traveling in both sides. By the way,
that
more
will
people are willing to. Yeah.
Shushan, do you want to jump in?
I do. You might have seen me squirming when Peter was talking because I wanted to ask this question, but I'm going to ask the minister here. I want to ask about the diaspora's role in terms of economic engagement, but I'm curious if you have a sense of traditional diaspora versus Hayastan emigres. Because something we noticed was traditional diaspora engaged in philanthropy kind of through institutions, through one particular routine, whereas Hayastan emigres usually tend to look to remittances and to kin, right? This is a very personal type of engagement. But something I observed personally, especially during the war, but COVID as well, was kind of Hayastan emigres contributing beyond the kin network, thinking about investing in the state or contributing to particular organizations.
You're saying they are beginning to think beyond family, beyond family,
beyond friends, beyond personal networks and connections. What can you say about kind of diaspora engagement in the economic sphere?
Particularly digital.
Yeah.
What is your name, by the I'm sorry.
Shushan.
Dr. Shushan Karapetian was born in Armenia and came when she was 14. So we cover the world between us.
Okay, very, very good question and very important, I think, because for me, people from diaspora are just the really only chance for Armenia to thrive, because I mean, I used to be a businessman doing business in 4 countries, and in every new country that I entered, I could realize that I'm not a competitive guy in that new country, because the environment from where I started was not competitive. So Armenia was closed economy and non-competitive economy for 30 years, and there weren't any Western and top-tier companies in Armenia in many areas. I mean, banking may be an exception in this by this means, because we had HSBC and Crédit Agricole here, so that, but in all other areas we didn't have multinational companies that could become a school for competitive people. So, and accordingly, so in Armenia there are very few competitive people. But I mean, and therefore, I mean, one of the main factors or main decision points that I have in appointing people in managerial positions is giving them is getting people from diaspora to the leading management roles in the government, and I yesterday appointed a new deputy, Hakobyan, that repatriated to Armenia from the Netherlands last November, and she is a top professional in business and law, and I'm happy to have her looking after small and medium enterprises, and I'm sure that she'll do an amazing job. The previous deputy minister was
can I interrupt? Because I know that you are doing this in the ministry.
Two more sentences, yeah.
Sure.
Two more sentences in this
Sure.
respect. I mean, and I think that, and I have appointed like more than 10 people, and I have appointed just one person from Armenia, and all others were from abroad. And I really think that having competitive people next to us and even give them the most important roles will dramatically change the situation in Armenia. So, and therefore, I think that diaspora in Armenia's economic growth is in-kind contribution, personal involvement, and personal management. So, therefore, I mean, I think that we have to open ourselves and open our minds and give away or throw away our ambitions and just put on the top priority the nation's interest, so that we really do a good job and make a real jump and make Armenia a powerful state.
I'm going to pursue on what you just said for just 1 minute, because that's all we've got. Is it fair to say that much of the presence of diasporans in Armenia has been in non-collaborative situations, either within the economy ministry or within businesses? That is, they're in the arts, in civil society, but the integration of diasporans within the structure of Armenia's institutions has often not been smooth. Is it fair to say, to hope, that within the business world, that is a possibly smoother interaction because of the interests? Did I ask it too politely? Should I rephrase my question?
No, it's okay. I think that yes,
you've got 1 minute.
Right. You're completely right, and the main obstacle here is actually probably the mindset of the people in the public sector, so that all they are just holding from their jobs, and there is no competition. There is an excessive protection of the jobs there, and I think that this has to be changed, and the laws has to be changed, allowing diaspora broad involvement in all areas of the government and the management of the country, so that we really get the most important thing. So this is the competence that the diaspora people have. I mean, we need this much more than any remittance or any investment or any relief that we receive. So, and Armenia's case is just an example of that. So they don't provide money; they provide expertise, and this is much more helpful and saves lives.
And Armenia's case is also a good example because it means from the diaspora side, there's an understanding that this is a long-term step-by-step process and is not a matter of parachuting in, giving advice, and leaving. So, thank you, Minister Vahan Karapetian, for participating in this discussion of Digital Nation. I hope that our conversations continue. I want to also thank, of course, Shushan Karapetian and Vicken Cheterian for joining me again in this third episode of Network Nation. Thank you all. And thank you for following. This is now 3 episodes of Network Nation. Next week, we have 2 episodes on Wednesday and on Friday. On Wednesday, we'll be talking about Network Nation. That is, we started from Crisis Nation with the hope, the anticipation that in fact there is a path to becoming not a crisis nation, but a network nation. Our final conversation will be Global Nation, where we will actually speak to the various communities on the ground, as I said earlier, in communities from which we don't often hear. All of these programs are, of course, on YouTube, on Facebook, on the Institute's site, armenian.usc.edu. They are available for sharing, and I hope that you find aspects of these conversations worth sharing, because the post-COVID, post-war situation is a continuing crisis, yes, but anybody and everybody keeps saying that we've got to turn it into an opportunity for Armenia's development, for Artsak's development, and for peace in the region. Thank you for following us. Think about visiting armenian.usc.edu and looking at the opportunity to also record My Armenian Story. That is your story, your and your family's story. Thank you for following us at the USC Institute of Armenian Studies.